And we're back, still with Stefan Molyneux of Freedom Main Radio, and it's a real pleasure to talk to Stefan. And Stefan, I came across you about probably not even a year ago, and you're one of the people who I saw, I forget the video exactly, but I think it was something along the lines of something about your enslavement.
Oh, the story of your enslavement.
Yes,
That's my Bohemian Rhapsody, and everything else I do seems to be outtakes from B-sides. But yeah, that's my big hit.
Yeah, I saw that, and right from there, I was like, oh, I need more of this, and I started just Googling or YouTubing Stefan Molyneux for a number of days, which is what I did actually when I first heard about the word anarchy. The first person I personally heard about, I've never actually read an Ayn Rand book. I have to admit that. I've been against paper books for a number of years. I'm a computer nerd, and I could never get it back in the old days in electronic form, so I refused to read it. That's a little bit of a quirk about me. I'm a bit of a computer nerd that way. But so the first way that I found out about anarchism was through a guy who you know named Doug Casey. And he actually had just written a really short article on the internet, and it was just kind of a little tiny article. It didn't really mean much, but it was saying don't be nice to customs border guard people. And I had been traveling at the time, and I really I just totally agree with everything he said. And from there I just Googled Doug Casey for about a month straight, and so that's how I got into that side of things. But when I saw your video, I knew right away that you were definitely someone I had to pay attention to in this sphere. And then I went to your website, and I have to say, at first I was a little confused. The website is about childhood and about philosophy, and it seemed to me a number of disparate items, religion, and only just now, when you just talked in the last segment about childhood, did I see the connection you're getting at between anarchy and family. You're basically saying that a lot of people just have never grown up from being children. Is that generally how you've tied all this together? What's your general framework for all of this?
Well, there's the old poetic line, the child is the father of the man. And I think that when we look at society as a whole, it's very easy to take it as you see it, as a snapshot of people without a history, of adults walking around making rational decisions based on just being adults. That's not what the science indicates. The science indicates that childhood, our experiences within childhood, good, bad, and indifferent, have an enormous, enormous, enormous foundational impact on our thinking, on our capacity to reason, on our approach to relationships, on our big picture view of society. This is enormously influenced by our childhood histories. And unfortunately, it's most influenced by the stuff we can't even remember in the first couple of years of life. And if we don't look at the degree to which people's interactions as adults are shaped by their early experiences as children, then the world remains a kind of baffling mystery. Like, you know, taxation as theft is not a complicated algorithm to process. I mean, you may agree with it in terms of it's good or it's bad, but the fact that taxation is the initiation of force is not really that hard to figure out. And like most people, when you talk about this, you think that's going to be a pretty easy thing. And you're going to talk about the pluses and minuses. But what happens, Jeff, is that you say taxation is theft, and people go, you know, they just kind of like, you can see this spasm occur in their brain. And it took me a long time to figure this out, and I've done a lot of research in this. I've talked to a lot of subject matter experts, psychologists, and all that on my show, and I've done a whole series called The Bomb in the Brain, which people can get a hold of at fdrurl.com/BIB. And in it, I trace the sort of science with an interview with Dr. Vince Felitti, who's the head of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And it's very, very clear that people's capacity to reason is enormously diminished if they experience adverse childhood experiences. What happens is then they have prejudices, which they're unconscious of. And you can see this in brain scans. This isn't just made up stuff, right? So someone comes across a new argument or a new piece of information. They experience anxiety right deep down in their amygdala, and then they make up a reason for that anxiety afterwards. That people experience anxiety or stress deep down in their brains, and then afterwards they make up a reason why. So when you say to someone taxation is theft, it sets off alarm bells in their head, which they're not conscious of, and then the reasoning ex post facto, after the fact reasoning shows up which is why you can't ever change people's minds, because until you can address the core anxiety, you can't change people's minds, because fundamentally there's no mind to change yet. And so my goal has been, look, let's think about what a society would look like if all children in the world were raised without aggression, without raised voices, without being hit, without being terrorized, without threats of hell or punishments aplenty. And it's pretty clear what we would see. What we would see is a massive reduction in things like drug addiction, promiscuity, cigarette addiction, alcoholism would be down. Well, we'll get to your case in a moment. But no, so there'd be much less criminality. If you look at the childhoods of political leaders, they're almost always incredibly dysfunctional. And so there'd much less hunger for political power, much less criminality. The two things that seem to hold the state together in people's minds, which is this surging criminality and the need to clamp down and control it, those two things would fade away if children were raised peacefully and happily, and people would actually be able to accept rational and empirical arguments, because they wouldn't have these bombs of anxiety going off in their head based on early childhood experiences. So that's my approach. I could be right, I could be wrong. I don't believe that politics is how we're going to do it. I think that it is an evolution in child rearing that we really need, and there's lots of evidence to show this, that countries which have banned childhood corporal punishment for children, and there have been a number of European countries in particular that have banned it, have much lower incidence of going to war, and they tend to be more open to viewing people who, say, are addicted to drugs as people with a problem that needs to be solved, rather than criminals who need to be locked up and have the key thrown away. There's a lot of compassion that comes out of people who are raised peacefully, or at least without corporal punishment, and that seems to be, I think, the way to go. Again, I could be wrong. Maybe, Ron Paul will rescue us all, but I don't believe that's the case. I think it's a multi-generational process of improving the way that we treat children, and from there, I think we will end up with a peaceful society where authority will be unsought by empty people who lust for power over others, and will be viewed as unnecessary by people who face almost no threats to their persons and property from the criminal class that largely vanishes when children are treated well.
That's interesting, because I have come from a slightly different angle on it, but I'm very interested in your views, and it makes a lot of sense. To me, it appears like most of the problems that we have today are because of the state, so we're coming from similar angles in that respect. Just the fact that people are raised basically from day one in the state, put into indoctrination camps. The media is basically one and the same with the state in many cases. They're told just the statist angle from pretty much the day they're born, and then they're given pensions from the government, or they are right now, they won't be in the future. But for me, the angle that I've always taken is all of these problems of these people who can't see what's going on is, to me, I just consider them brainwashed, because they've been raised in this artificial, non-free market system for most of their life. So it's very interesting to hear that you think part of it isn't just that. You believe that it's in how people raise their children also has a great effect on how people are more open to seeing what's really going on when they become adults. Is that basically correct?
Yeah, that is true, and I really wanted to reinforce the point that you're making, Jeff, that I don't believe that it is a circular system, right? So you're absolutely right that the indoctrination that children receive in government schools fuels their addiction and belief in government. No question about that. That's absolutely, I mean, I completely agree with that. And the fact that rising tax rates have caused so many families around the world, and particularly in the West, to end up with two parents working. And then you put your kid into a state daycare, where, at least according to the research I've read recently, at least here in Quebec in Canada, they have significant drops in language skills, because children should be raised by their parents, or at least one of their parents. I mean, it seems weird to even have to say that, like that's some sort of radical thing. It's like saying married couples should live together, The parents should raise their kids. They ideally shouldn't put them in daycare unless there's some extreme necessity like illness or something. Yes, parents should raise their own kids. So I just want to point out that, sure, yes, the state and the healthy family are, to me, exact opposites, and they are at war. The healthier the family gets, the less power the state is going to have, and so it is in the state's interest to diminish and to undermine the family. And certainly here in Canada, there have been billions and billions of dollars funded into some pretty radical feminist groups which have said, you know, women can't be fulfilled unless they go out to work and so on. But that's really good for the state. I mean, it turns a non-taxable income like raising kids and being a housewife into a taxable income called being an employee, and it also places kids earlier and earlier into the tender arms of the state, and that makes the state even more powerful. So it is a cycle. I mean, I think you're right. We need to be aware of what's happening on the state side, but I think we also need to be aware of its origins within the family.
That's very interesting. We had a podcast just a few days ago with Oliver Westcott of Anarcho-Capitalist.org live from London about the UK riots, and this being Anarchast, we were basically saying that those people rioting aren't anarchists, and I know you know that. But I did see you put out your own video, and it was excellent. I watched it, and you took it from the, I guess, both angles, the state and how it's affecting families, and how it's making people have broken families in the UK. And you basically said that was the main, one of the main causes for what was the riots going on in London and the UK. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, in the UK as a whole, there's been a pretty enormous shattering of the family over the last generation or two, and of course in the black communities in particular, it's 50% of kids growing up without a father, and a significant proportion of them growing up in households where they've never seen anyone work. And then they go to these terrible state schools, they live in these terrible government ghettos, in government housing. It is all just wretched, and then they can't find jobs because taxes and regulations are so high that, I mean, one of the things that happens is the middle class likes to use the government to keep the poor from competing with them. And so it has these barriers to entry, licensing and so on, that keeps the young people from being entrepreneurs and undercutting the older people. I mean, imagine if these kids were just allowed to go out and get jobs as plumbers if they were reasonable at it and people wanted them to do it, rather than having to go through 2 or 5 or 10 years or whatever it is of apprenticeship. So yeah, I think it is really tragic. I mean, and this was all well foreseen. This is nothing, I'm not particularly smart in this area. This was all predicted. Charles Taylor wrote about it many years ago, that you create a system where you can have families with a guaranteed income without the traditional underpinnings of the family, right? So one person working and sort of some deferral of gratification in terms of having families later. Then you're going to end up with this kind of mess where you can have kids as a job, and the dad feels less motivation to stick around because the kids are going to be taken care of anyway, which means that the woman has to be less choosy about who she's having sex with or whether she's using protection and so on. So yeah, it is a complete mess. Now, you know, not to say that these kids have no moral responsibility, they do, but I think we have to look at the statistics of where these things are occurring and look at the degree to which family breakdown has had a significant impact on the way that these kids have developed and their relationship to their society as a whole.
Totally. I totally agree, as always. I don't think I ever really disagree with you. We're both basically seeing things the same way. When we come back, I just want to ask you one more question. I know you're a busy guy, and I just want to ask you how you see us moving towards a better world, what we can all do personally to get there. So we'll be right back in part 3 after this.